Hey, good afternoon. My name is Neil Doshi, and I'm a junior majoring in finance at Penn State. And this is my IST 402 checkpoint presentation. Sort of going back from the last time when I said, being a finance major, I sort of want to understand more how our financial system has developed and what sort of things have changed from the time it started back in the 1700s and 1800s. Because back then we only had a couple of banks that sort of ran the system. Now we still only have a couple of banks that run the system, but overall in a system we have almost 5,000 banks. That's sort of, in a simple way, we can say that we have many small banks and very few big banks, which eventually run the economy. And that sort of creates a lot of agency costs because there's definitely a good amount of monopoly that is there. But, a lot of the power sort of explains what's happening in our society financially, politically, and socially. Sometimes I believe that, if there are some reasons that we give these small banks to become big through the evidence of how the big banks have become big, I think that sort of can be really explained through my project. And I simply want to use crowdsourcing because I think that's probably one of the easiest ways I can get a lot of data and sort of understand how I can improve and how these banks can improve. To get to the scope of my project, I really want to understand what the project does on a concrete level and what sort of factors undermine the growth and how, if they put together, can explain a small bank precisely how to make money. I think that I want to create a really big survey that sort of gives me analytical, quantitative, and qualitative aspects of data, different key metrics to rate the big banks and create constraints that will undermine which bank has to be successful in what scenario and how do these small banks can eventually replicate those scenarios and become big that they want to be, and really understand the milestone that is presented in front of them, whether it be financial, political, or social, and go ahead with that. I think given the statistical world that we live today with the data analysis, I want to generalize the data to see how small banks can undermine different benchmarks for themselves, understand what the benchmark means quantitatively, qualitatively, understand what the data is for them, and ultimately use that data for their own benefit financially and non-financially. Sort of coming back to cut two, when I started doing a bit of my own research, I come across various articles, did a bit of my own survey before I did the actual survey to understand what sort of makes these big banks big in the first place. And I think that the first thing that sort of really came across my mind was, data sort of varies between people. Finance people have different, customers have different, and general public have different. So I wanted to split the data according to three people, obviously finance, customers, and general public being each of them. Then I also wanted to give a much more personalized and set data for all of them to see how they evaluate various criteria. So for example, I'll probably be given cash liquidity to someone who works in finance, or something like customer service for one of their customers, or in general, how do you think these banks have evolved for the general public? And ultimately, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get more narrowed down data from each of these three types of people and understand much more concrete level on what people mean when they think of big banks. Finally, at the end of these five criteria that I have, I also want to get some quantitative data, which sort of understands how their experience has been with this bank. So for an analyst who's researching about the bank, he can explain what the bank means to him. Or for a customer, he can see how cash was easily available to him. Or for the general public who think how these banks have changed for their ancestors to what they're right now and overall. At the end of it, I want to give a good rating to most of these banks out of 100 with small notes to explain why these banks have that rating. Because ultimately, when a smaller bank gets this data and understands what needs to be done, he needs to understand what made these banks big and how can they use these characteristics to become big themselves. Ultimately, obviously, at the end of this presentation, and even at the moment that I'm in, I've had a lot of issues. The major being the time of the outbreak. Given the time that we all are in the outbreak, I was quarantined myself for almost 10 days, and that has sort of really taken a toll back on what I thought on amount of data I'll be collecting. Next, I think there's definitely a lot of understanding of the core of the problem, and I need a much more detailed explanation to really, really nail this hard and get crowdsourcing to its very best. Finally, I also want to see how effective the data is because with past experience, I see that people on MTurk are really not that really not that open-minded, and really they just put things to get the easy money, and I don't want that to happen with my project. And finally, I also want to understand special situations and some conditions. I think overall I'm definitely behind in terms of time, but with my dedicated efforts and my passion for finance, I think I'll be able to get it all done by the end of the semester. Thank you for listening and have a great week ahead.